Bears aren't naturally aggressive creatures. They typically keep to themselves as long as they're healthy and unprovoked. But if there's one surefire way to provoke a grizzly, it's approaching her cubs. That's precisely what this man did, and the outcome was anything but peaceful. In this video, we'll take you through the heart-pounding moment when the mother grizzly charged at him. Did he make it out alive? Stick around to find out. Tom Larson, a seasoned adventurer, had spent years exploring Alaska's wilderness, conquering rugged trails and remote landscapes. Overconfident in his abilities, he believed no challenge was too great. It was late September, and autumn's golden hues covered the forest. Hiking toward a secluded alpine lake, Tom felt alive, savoring the solitude and untouched beauty around him. The forest was quiet, almost too calm, with only the sound of leaves rustling and his boots crunching underfoot. Suddenly, two small figures caught his eye. Bear cubs, tumbling and playing in a nearby clearing. Excitement surged through him. He knew the dangers of approaching cubs, but couldn't resist the rare opportunity to see them up close. Ignoring his better judgment, Tom carefully stepped off the trail, moving closer to the cubs. His heart raced with exhilaration as he crouched low, creeping through the underbrush. The cubs, unaware of his presence, continued playing, their fur golden and shaggy. Now, yards away, Tom marveled at their small size compared to the massive grizzlies he'd seen before. He felt an awe that made all his explorations worthwhile. But in a split second, everything changed. From the dense bushes just beyond the clearing, a low, guttural growl rumbled through the air. Tom's blood ran cold. His eyes darted toward the source of the sound, and there, emerging from the shadows, was the mother bear. The show was enormous, far larger than any bear Tom had ever seen. Her fur, thick and matted from the coming winter, bristled with agitation. Her dark eyes locked onto him, and her lips curled back, revealing long, yellowed teeth. She let out a roar, a primal sound that reverberated through the trees, sending a jolt of terror through Tom's body. He had made a grave mistake. The sow had likely been nearby watching her cubs, and now she saw him as a threat. Her protective instincts had kicked in, and there was no mistaking her intent. She was going to defend her young, and Tom was her target. Panic set in, and Tom's heart pounded in his chest. His survival instincts screamed at him to flee, but he knew that running from a bear was futile. Grizzlies could reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, far faster than any human. But in his terror, logic abandoned him and he bolted. Tom sprinted back toward the trail, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. Branches scratched at his face and roots threatened to trip him with every step. Behind him, the sow roared again, and he could hear the unmistakable sound of her massive paws thundering after him. The earth seemed to shake beneath her weight. His lungs burned with the effort, and his legs felt like lead as he pushed himself to run faster, but the bear was gaining on him. He dared not look back, knowing that the sight of the charging bear would only paralyze him with fear. Instead, he focused on the trail ahead, desperately searching for any possible escape. The dense forest closed in around him, the trees a blur of brown and green as he ran. His backpack, heavy with supplies, slowed him down, and in a panicked motion he ripped it off, hoping it might distract the bear. It landed with a thud behind him, but the bear didn't stop. The sound of her breathing was terrifyingly close now. He could hear the snorts of exertion, the rhythmic pounding of her paws. He was out of time. With a final burst of energy, Tom tried to veer off the trail, hoping to find refuge in the thick trees, but before he could make his escape, the bear caught up to him. A mighty paw swiped at his back, and the force sent him tumbling to the ground. He hit the earth hard, his vision spinning as pain exploded through his body. Before he could recover, the bear was on him. She towered over him, her massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed him whole. With a furious snarl, she brought her powerful jaws down on his shoulder, and Tom screamed, though no one was around to hear him. The pain was unimaginable, a searing agony that shot through his entire body. He struggled, kicking and flailing in a desperate attempt to fend her off, but the bear was relentless. She bit down again, this time on his arm, the bones snapping under the pressure of her jaws. Blood soaked his clothing, and the world around him seemed to fade into a haze of pain and terror. Tom tried to crawl away, using his one good arm to drag himself along the ground, but the bear wouldn't let him go. She swiped at him again, her claws tearing into his flesh, leaving deep, ragged gashes across his back. The force of the blow sent him sprawling, his body limp and broken. The attack seemed to last forever, but eventually the bear relented. Perhaps she had decided he was no longer a threat to her cubs. With a final, thunderous growl, she turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing as quickly as she had appeared. Tom lay there, barely conscious, his body battered and torn. Blood pooled beneath him, and each breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. His vision blurred as the pain threatened to pull him into unconsciousness. He had survived the attack, but just barely. The Alaskan wilderness, once a place of beauty and adventure, had turned into a nightmare. Now all that remained was the hope that someone would find him before it was too late. Steve Palmer had always prided himself on his independence and love for adventure, even if he lacked the experience that usually came with such ambitions. His trip to a national park in the U.S. in September 23 was no different. It was a test of his resolve, a solo venture meant to prove to himself that he could survive in the wilderness. The problem was that Steve was not the seasoned outdoorsman he imagined himself to be. The warnings had been everywhere. Grizzly sightings had surged in the area due to an unusually active bear season. Visitors were advised to travel in groups, carry bear spray, and make noise to deter the animals. Yet Steve, eager to push his limits, viewed the cautions as exaggerated. He dismissed the need for bear spray, reasoning it was unlikely he'd ever cross paths with one. He preferred the silence of the woods over the sound of bells or shouts, despite their effectiveness in keeping predators at bay. The trail he chose was dense and winding, leading through thick forest and up into the hills. The air was crisp with the beginnings of autumn, and the ground was littered with freshly fallen leaves. The canopy overhead blocked out much of the sunlight, making the forest floor seem darker and more isolated than it actually was. Steve moved along, oblivious to the fact that he was entering the heart of grizzly territory. Unbeknownst to him, a grizzly bear had picked up his scent from miles away. Bears, with their acute sense of smell, could detect food and human odors from a great distance. Steve, having skipped breakfast in his rush to get started, had tucked a half-eaten granola bar into the side pocket of his backpack. The smell of the food, combined with his human scent, was like a beacon for the bear, which had begun to follow him in silence, navigating through the underbrush with ease. As Steve made his way deeper into the woods, the trail became less defined. The sounds of nature around him, the occasional bird call, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, were the only indicators of life, but these comforting sounds masked the presence of the grizzly. It was a large male, weighing nearly 600 pounds, and had been tracking Steve for almost an hour, biding its time, following at a distance. The bear was no stranger to humans, but hunger and curiosity drove it closer, step by step. Steve paused to take a sip of water, standing at the edge of a small clearing. It was here, as the breeze shifted, that the bear caught a stronger whiff of Steve's scent. It crept closer, using the dense foliage as cover. Steve, still unaware of the predator nearby, resumed his hike, tightening the straps on his backpack and moving at a quicker pace as the terrain began to rise uphill. His legs burned from the exertion and his breathing became more labored, but the thrill of the hike kept him going. The bear, now emboldened, quickened its pace as well. It moved silently through the woods, its massive paws barely making a sound as they padded across the forest floor. Only now had the distance between them shrunk. Steve was no longer a hiker on a peaceful trek. He had unknowingly become prey. The bear's dark eyes focused on him, and it moved with the intent of a hunter closing in on its target. It wasn't until Steve reached the top of a small ridge and stopped to catch his breath that he sensed something was wrong. Steve turned slowly, scanning the trees behind him, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. His heart began to race, not from the exertion, but from the sudden sense of unease that washed over him. Something felt off. As he stood there, straining to hear any unusual sounds, the bear emerged from the brush behind him just 30 feet away. It moved with shocking speed, covering the distance between them in seconds. Steve caught the blur of movement in his peripheral vision and turned just as the bear let out a guttural roar, its powerful legs propelling it forward with terrifying force. Panic surged through Steve's body. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but it was too late. The bear was already on him, knocking him to the ground with a single swipe of its massive paw. The impact was brutal, sending him sprawling across the dirt. His backpack, torn open by the bear's claws, scattered its contents across the forest floor, including the granola bar that had likely drawn the bear closer. Steve tried to scramble to his feet, but the bear was relentless. It swiped again, this time catching his leg and dragging him backward. The pain was excruciating, sharp, and all-consuming as the bear's claws dug into his flesh. Steve kicked out wildly, but his efforts were futile against the predator's sheer strength. The grizzly bit down on his shoulder, the pressure crushing as it shook him violently. At that moment, Steve's world shrank to the sensation of pain and the sound of the bear's heavy breathing. His vision blurred and his strength faded as he struggled beneath the bear's weight. The animal, sensing its dominance, loosened its grip briefly, only to bite down again, tearing through muscle and bone with terrifying ease. Steve's mind raced with desperate thoughts. He had come here for an adventure, to test his limits, but now, lying in the dirt, the realization hit him. He had underestimated the raw, unrelenting power of nature. The warnings had been accurate, and he had ignored them, thinking himself invincible. But the wild did not care for pride or inexperience. As his strength waned, and the world around him dimmed, Steve's body went limp, his last thoughts a blur of regret and disbelief. The bear, sensing that the fight had left him, finally stepped away, leaving his broken form lying in the forest. It took 2 days for the search parties to find him. By then, there was little left to recover. The remnants of Steve Palmer's backpack were scattered across the clearing, and his torn clothing lay in shreds nearby. His remains, half consumed and partially buried by the bear, were a grim reminder of the dangers that lurk in the wilderness. For the rangers who found him, it was a familiar but sobering sight. They had warned hikers time and again, but every year some ventured into the wild unprepared. Steve Palmer had been one of them, a cautionary tale of what happens when the power of nature is underestimated. The Brantley family eagerly awaited their November 2022 vacation to a remote cabin in British Columbia. James and Sarah Brantley, their 2 children, Mason and Sophie, and their golden retriever, Rocky, were ready for a break from city life. Surrounded by pine trees and wilderness, the cabin offered perfect solitude. No phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just nature. For the first few days, the trip was peaceful. They hiked, explored the forest, and enjoyed evenings by the fireplace. However, a critical mistake soon jeopardized their safety. After dinners, they left food scraps inside the cabin, unknowingly attracting wildlife. The cabin was in grizzly bear territory, and as winter approached, hungry bears were searching for food. On their 4th night, the stillness of the wilderness was shattered by a loud bang at the front door. Startled, James and Sarah rushed to investigate. To their horror, a massive grizzly bear was slamming its paws against the door, drawn by the scent of food. The flimsy door shook under the bear's relentless force. James grabbed a flashlight, illuminating the towering figure of the grizzly, its claws scraping the wood. Realizing the door wouldn't hold, Sarah quickly gathered the children and retreated to a back room, barricading it with furniture. The family huddled together, terrified as the bear continued its assault. The door eventually gave way and the bear stormed inside, destroying the cabin in search of food. For hours, the family listened in fear as the bear overturned furniture and smashed through the kitchen. They knew their mistake had caused this danger. Huddled in silence, they prayed the bear wouldn't break into their hiding place, while the sounds of destruction echoed through the night. At one point, the bear seemed to fixate on the area just outside the back room. There was a long, drawn-out snuffling sound, followed by heavy breathing right by the barricaded door. The animal knew they were there. For a terrifying moment, the door shook as the bear pushed its massive body against it, trying to force its way through. The furniture they had stacked against the door shifted, creaking under the weight of the attack. James braced himself, holding his breath, mentally preparing for the door to splinter at any moment. The kids clung to Sarah, their faces buried in her chest, trying to muffle their whimpers. Mason's small body trembled in fear, and Sophie bit her lip so hard it began to bleed. It seemed impossible that the door would hold against the bear's raw power. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the assault on the door stopped. The bear grunted once more, then turned its attention back to the kitchen. The cabin had become a war zone, with shattered glass and splintered wood scattered everywhere. Time crawled at an agonizing pace as the family remained trapped, listening helplessly to the animal as it tore apart their temporary sanctuary. Hours dragged on, and the cold of the night began to seep through the cabin's broken walls. The family shivered, more from fear than from the temperature. Their minds raced with thoughts of how long the bear would remain, how long they would have to endure this living nightmare. Finally, as dawn began to break, a faint glimmer of light filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls. The bear's activity seemed to slow. The family heard the animal's heavy breathing as it lumbered around the cabin one last time, perhaps realizing that there was no more food to be found. With a final loud grunt, it exited through the shattered doorway. They stayed in the back room, too terrified to move for what felt like an eternity. The silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the chaos. The destruction was done, but the emotional toll remained. It was only when the faint sound of distant voices reached their ears that they dared to believe help was coming. Rescuers arrived mid-morning, alerted by neighbors several kilometers away who had heard strange noises during the night and suspected trouble. As they approached the cabin, they were met with a scene of destruction. The front door was completely gone. The walls had deep claw marks, and the interior looked like a tornado had passed through. But the family had survived. The rescuers were astonished that the bear had caused such devastation but had failed to reach the Brantleys. It was a miracle that the flimsy back room had held. The family was shaken but unharmed, grateful for their safety, though the psychological scars of the night would remain with them forever. As they were escorted out of the wreckage, the weight of what they had endured settled in. Their quiet vacation had turned into a fight for survival, one they never anticipated. They had learned a painful lesson about the dangers of underestimating the wild, and they would carry it with them for the rest of their lives. Mike Rogers had always found solace in the rivers of Canada's Yukon. The wild, untamed beauty of the land, with its crisp air, towering mountains, and thick forests, had become a familiar backdrop to his fishing trips. For years, Mike had fished these remote waters, earning the title of a seasoned angler among his peers. He had grown comfortable navigating the rugged terrain and braving the elements, gaining an almost symbiotic relationship with the wildness around him. But in 2023, one fateful morning would prove that even the most experienced outdoorsman could misstep. It was early, and the sky was still a soft shade of pink as the first hints of sunlight touched the horizon. The river gurgled gently beside him, flowing with the energy of spring melt, while the surrounding forest remained cloaked in shadow. Mike relished these quiet moments, his senses alert to the sounds of nature around him, the rhythmic rush of the river, the distant call of a bird, and the occasional rustling of leaves from some unseen creature. This was his sanctuary. As the sun began its slow climb, Mike cast his line into the river, aiming for a section of water where the current slowed slightly, prime territory for trout. The rod in his hand was an extension of his body, a tool he had mastered long ago. Each flick of his wrist, each tug of the line was part of a routine honed through years of practice. Soon, the line pulled taut, and Mike's heart quickened. He had a catch. The fish fought back, and Mike braced himself, digging his boots into the soft earth by the riverbank. His muscles strained as he worked to reel it in, anticipating the moment when he would hold the wriggling trout in his hands. But his focus on the fish caused him to lose track of the world around him, the subtle shift in the sounds of the forest, and the low, almost imperceptible growl that echoed from the underbrush. Unbeknownst to Mike, he had wandered into grizzly territory. The great bear had been drawn to the river's edge by the abundance of fish in the stream, a vital resource for it as it prepared for the long winter ahead. The grizzly's world was one of dominance, every scent, every sound layered with the knowledge that it ruled these lands. This was its territory, and Mike was now a trespasser. As Mike continued his battle with the fish, the bear's presence grew closer, its massive form moving with a surprising silence for something so significant. It stood at the tree line for a moment, watching the angler, perhaps assessing the threat this human posed. For the bear, the river was not just a place to feed, but an extension of its domain, and this man was disturbing the natural order. Suddenly, the bear moved, a blur of muscle and fur charging toward the unsuspecting Mike. The ground shook beneath its weight as it barreled forward with astonishing speed, its eyes locked on the man by the river. Mike sensed it too late. The grizzly's pounding footsteps echoed in his ears as he glanced up, his heart dropping into his stomach. Before Mike could react, the bear collided with him, the force of the impact sending him sprawling backward into the river. The frigid water engulfed him instantly, his fishing rod slipping from his grasp, forgotten in the chaos. The current pulled at him, dragging him downstream, but the grizzly wasn't done. With terrifying power, the bear swiped at him, its massive paw catching his leg and yanking him deeper into the water. The river, which had once been Mike's sanctuary, had now become a prison. His limbs thrashed, desperate for purchase, but the water was relentless, and so was the bear. The beast towered over him, its eyes dark and wild with territorial fury. It clamped its jaws onto Mike's shoulder, the sharp teeth piercing his flesh as it shook him violently. Pain shot through Mike's body, but the cold water dulled the sharpness of it, leaving only a deep, throbbing ache. The river churned around them, the once peaceful current now a chaotic torrent as the Grizzly wrestled with Mike. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle as the weight of the bear and the water bore down on him. He clawed at the rocky riverbed, trying to find something, anything to hold on to, but the river seemed intent on pulling him further downstream. The bear dragged him across the shallows, its massive frame looming over him like a force of nature. With each movement, it thrashed him against the rocks and the river's bottom, a brutal demonstration of its dominance. Mike's vision blurred as the pain and cold seeped into his bones. His body, once solid and sure, now felt weak and heavy, the will to survive slipping away with each passing second. The Grizzly, satisfied that the intruder was no longer a threat, released Mike. It stood over him for a moment, breathing heavily, its fur matted with water and blood. For the bear, this had been a defense of its home, its territory, and now, with the threat neutralized, it returned to its business. The river, its rightful domain, continued to flow as it always had, indifferent to the violence that had just occurred. Mike's body, battered and broken, was carried by the current, drifting downstream. His fishing gear had already been swept away, scattered along the river's banks like remnants of a forgotten life. For days, search teams scoured the area, hoping against hope that they might find him alive. But it wasn't until the third day that they recovered his body, wedged between rocks in a quiet bend of the river, miles from where the attack had taken place. The Grizzly's attack was swift, brutal, and final, a reminder of the natural world's power and unpredictability. For all his experience and years spent in the wilderness, Mike had become another cautionary tale, a stark warning about the risks of infringing on a wild animal's territory. The rivers of the Yukon, beautiful and serene, were also home to creatures far more dangerous than any fish, creatures that ruled the land with an ancient primal force. In the end, the grizzly bear remained the true master of its domain, a creature whose dominance could not be challenged, not even by a seasoned angler like Mike Rogers. The summer of 2024 was warm and radiant, drawing crowds to one of Canada's most breathtaking natural wonders. Jen Miller, a 28-year-old adventurer from Ohio, was one of the many who had flown in to bask in the beauty of the sprawling landscapes. With her social media accounts alive with followers who marveled at her scenic posts, she was determined to capture moments that would outshine all previous uploads. And this particular day seemed like the perfect opportunity to do just that. Jen's path wound through thick forests, mountain vistas, and crystalline rivers. The towering peaks of the Rockies loomed in the background as she hiked, her camera always within arm's reach. She'd been walking for a couple of hours when she noticed a stirring in the bushes not too far from the trail. It was subtle at first, a mere rustling sound, but as she squinted through the sunlight filtering through the trees, her breath caught. A massive grizzly bear stood only about 100 yards away, its fur a dark brown mass of muscle and power. Jen knew the rules, of course. The park was filled with warnings. Brochures, signs, and even the ranger's persistent reminders all shouted the same message. Keep your distance from wildlife. Grizzlies are dangerous, especially if startled or threatened. But for Jen, this moment felt different. It was rare to catch such a majestic animal this close, and the chance to get the perfect photograph for her followers seemed too tempting to resist. The bear was grazing lazily on the hillside, unaware of her presence for now. The setting was serene, too good to pass up. Jen's mind raced as she evaluated her options. If she stayed quiet and approached slowly, surely she could snap a quick selfie and leave before the bear even noticed. She convinced herself that it was just for a brief moment, just for the perfect shot. Besides, she'd seen countless tourists do similar things on their feeds without consequence. What could go wrong? She moved cautiously off the trail, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. The distance between her and the bear closed rapidly. 50 yards, 30, 25. As she reached the point she deemed close enough, she could feel the adrenaline pulsing in her veins. The grizzly bear was still occupied, ripping up chunks of grass and berries, its heavy paws sinking into the earth. Jen positioned herself so that the bear was just behind her, took out her phone, and angled the camera for the perfect selfie. That was when things changed. Without warning, the bear stopped what it was doing. Its head lifted, and its black eyes locked onto Jen's. There was no mistaking the change in its demeanor. A low rumble came from the bear's chest, a growl so deep and primal it sent a chill down Jen's spine. The bear's body tensed as it dropped to all fours, its powerful frame vibrating with raw energy. Jen froze, paralyzed by a sudden realization. She had made a grave mistake. Panic surged through her, and instinct kicked in. Jen turned to run, her feet scrambling to find purchase on the uneven ground. She could hear the deep breathing of the bear behind her, growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. The bear, no longer the serene creature from moments ago, had become a force of nature, angry, fast, and terrifyingly efficient. Grizzlies can cover distances at alarming speeds, and it took only seconds for the bear to close the gap between them. Jen's heart hammered in her chest as she sprinted, but the rough terrain slowed her down. Her foot caught on a root and she stumbled forward, her arms flailing to regain balance. The bear was almost upon her now, its guttural roar filling the air, and she felt a heavy weight crash into her back. The impact was brutal. Jen was thrown to the ground as the bear's massive paw struck her shoulder, sending a shockwave of pain through her body. She hit the dirt hard, her breath knocked out of her. Instinctively, she curled into a ball, trying to protect her head and neck as the grizzly bore down on her. She could feel the hot, rank breath of the animal as it snarled, its claws digging into her flesh with savage power. The attack was vicious and unrelenting. The bear's claws raked across her back, tearing through skin and muscle with ease. Jen screamed inwardly, her face pressed into the ground as the bear continued to maul her, its jaws snapping dangerously close to her neck. She could feel the searing pain of her body being torn apart, the unbearable agony of claws slicing deep into her legs and arms. From a distance, other tourists on the trail could only watch in helpless horror. Some screamed, waving their arms in a desperate attempt to distract the bear, but they were too far away to intervene. Others stood frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief at the brutality unfolding before them. Jen's world was shrinking. The pain was becoming so intense that it blurred her sense of reality. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into eternity as the bear's powerful jaws closed around her thigh, the pressure of its bite like a vice. She could hear the snapping of bones, a sound so grotesque it made her stomach lurch. Blood soaked the earth beneath her as the grizzly mauled her relentlessly. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the attack stopped. The bear, perhaps realizing that Jen was no longer a threat or simply satisfied with its dominance, released her and lumbered off into the woods. It left her broken and bloodied on the ground, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as she tried to comprehend the fact that she was still alive. Park rangers arrived minutes later, alerted by the panicked tourists who had witnessed the attack. The scene they found was grim. Jen lay motionless, her body battered and torn, blood pooling beneath her on the trail. She was alive, but barely. The severity of her injuries was horrifying. Deep gashes from the bear's claws, broken bones, and puncture wounds from its teeth. Emergency medical teams were swift to act, stabilizing her and rushing her to the nearest hospital. Jen's fight for survival wasn't over, and even as she was airlifted from the park, her fate hung in the balance. The scars, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. Jen Miller survived the attack, but the aftermath would change her life forever. Her body bore the permanent reminders of that terrifying encounter. Her limbs riddled with scars, her mobility forever altered. She spent months in recovery, undergoing surgeries and rehabilitation to regain some semblance of normalcy. But the psychological wounds were perhaps the deepest. The memory of those seconds when the bear charged, the feel of its claws and teeth tearing into her flesh, would haunt her forever. Dan had always felt at peace in the wilds of Alaska. The sprawling wilderness with its towering mountains and pristine lakes was his sanctuary. He had spent years exploring its rugged trails, each hike a deeper communion with nature. Max, his loyal Labrador, had been his companion on these adventures ever since he was a puppy. Over the years, they'd developed an unspoken bond, understanding each other's rhythms and enjoying the silence and the thrill of discovery. June 2023 was no different. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue that stretched endlessly overhead, and the dense forest around Anchorage was thick with the scent of pine. Dan and Max set out early one morning on a quiet trail they had hiked several times before. The trail was remote, far enough from the city that they rarely encountered other hikers. It was the kind of solitude Dan relished. With each step, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot was a familiar and comforting sound, one he had come to associate with freedom. Max, as usual, darted ahead, his nose leading him through the underbrush. He occasionally returned to Dan's side, his tongue lolling out in happiness. The sun was rising higher now, casting dappled light through the canopy. Everything seemed calm, tranquil even. But Alaska's wilderness was unpredictable, and it could turn dangerous without warning. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Max suddenly stopped in his tracks. His ears perked up and a low growl rumbled from his throat. Dan's heart skipped a beat. He had learned to trust Max's instincts. Something was wrong. Scanning the dense foliage ahead, Dan squinted, trying to see what had caught Max's attention. At first, there was nothing but the stillness of the forest. And then he saw it, a massive grizzly bear lurking in the shadows just off the trail, its golden-brown fur blending with the underbrush. The bear was enormous, easily weighing over 600 pounds, and its presence was imposing, a stark reminder of nature's raw power. Dan's pulse quickened, a sense of dread creeping over him. Grizzlies were common in Alaska, but encounters this close were rare and dangerous. He and Max had been cautious on every hike, carrying bear spray and keeping their distance whenever they spotted one from afar. But this time, the bear had seen them first. Max's barking intensified, his protective instincts kicking in. Before Dan could call him back, Max lunged forward, placing himself between the bear and his owner. The grizzly, startled by the sudden movement, reacted on instinct. Its eyes locked on Max, and in an instant it charged. The bear's sheer speed was terrifying. Dan's heart raced as he stood frozen for a split second, his mind struggling to process the situation. Max, brave as ever, tried to stand his ground, barking fiercely. But the bear, with its colossal strength, swiped at Max with one mighty paw. The blow was fatal. Dan watched in horror as Max's body crumpled under the force, his loyal companion gone in an instant. Shock and grief flooded Dan's senses. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing down to the sight of his fallen friend, and the monstrous bear standing over him. The loss was crushing, but there was no time to mourn. The bear, now fully aware of Dan's presence, turned its attention toward him. Panic surged through Dan as the bear fixed its gaze on him. He knew running would only trigger the bear's predatory instincts, but standing still seemed impossible. His mind raced, searching for options. He fumbled for the bear spray strapped to his belt. His hand shook as he unholstered it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The bear took a step toward him, its massive paws crushing the undergrowth beneath it. Dan pointed to the bear spray, his finger trembling as he pressed down on the trigger. A cloud of potent mist shot out, aimed directly at the bear's face. For a brief moment, he hoped it would be enough to deter the animal. The bear recoiled, shaking its head as the irritant hit its sensitive nose and eyes, but the respite was fleeting. Instead of retreating, the bear became more agitated, its roars echoing through the trees. It was a full-blown charge now, a 600-pound mass of fury and muscle barreling toward him. Adrenaline surged through Dan's veins. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the uneven ground, lungs burning as he sprinted down the trail. Every fiber of his being screamed for survival, but the bear was faster, more powerful. He could hear its heavy breaths, the snapping of branches as it closed the distance behind him. Dan's legs felt like they were moving through quicksand, the trail stretching endlessly before him. He glanced over his shoulder, and the sight of the bear gaining on him was enough to send a surge of fear, so primal it almost paralyzed him. The bear was relentless, its massive body moving with terrifying grace and speed. Dan stumbled, his foot catching on a rock. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring his body and knocking the wind out of him. Pain shot through his side as he scrambled to his feet, but it was too late. The bear was on him. The first swipe of the bear's paw sent Dan sprawling, the force of the blow leaving deep gashes in his side. The pain was searing, and he could feel the warm blood trickling down his skin. Desperately, he tried to shield himself, curling into a ball as the bear's jaws clamped down on his leg. The pressure was unbearable, bones cracking under the immense force. The world became a blur of pain and terror as the bear shook him like a rag doll. Dan's mind fought to stay conscious, but the agony was overwhelming. His thoughts drifted to Max, his brave companion who had tried to protect him, now gone forever. There was a moment, in the midst of the attack, where everything seemed to slow again. The bear's growls faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, slowing as blood loss and shock took over. Just when it seemed like the end, the bear suddenly released him. Dan's vision blurred, his body too weak to move, but through the haze of pain, he could hear distant voices. Park rangers, perhaps, drawn by the commotion. The bear, sensing the approach of humans, lumbered away into the forest, leaving Dan broken and bleeding on the ground. The rangers found him minutes later, unconscious and barely clinging to life. His body was a mess of torn flesh and shattered bones, the aftermath of a brutal encounter with nature's apex predator. They worked quickly, stabilizing him as best they could before rushing him to the nearest hospital. In the days that followed, Dan hovered between life and death. His injuries were severe: multiple fractures, deep lacerations, and a leg that might never fully heal. But the physical scars, though horrific, paled in comparison to the emotional wounds. The loss of Max weighed heavily on his heart, a grief that would never entirely subside. Even after months of recovery, the memory of that day haunted Dan. The forest, once a place of peace and solace, had become a reminder of the fragility of life, of the unpredictable violence lurking in the wild. Max's sacrifice in the terrifying attack left a scar deeper than any wound the bear had inflicted, one that would follow Dan for the rest of his life.